afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Lori Evanstein, and I'm the chair of the American Enterprise Institute at Brown. AEI at Brown was founded on campus last year to promote campus policy discussion around a variety of key policy issues and to promote the competition of ideas here on campus. Come see me at the end of the talk if you're interested in learning more about AEI at Brown and how to get involved. I would like to thank our co-sponsor, the Watson Institute, for their support and help with today's event. Today, we will participate in a discussion on reevaluating U.S. policy toward Iran with Ambassador Chas Freeman and Dr. Michael Rubin. Michael Rubin is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, senior lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Civil Military Relations, and a senior editor of the Middle East Quarterly. Rubin is a former Pentagon official whose research focused on the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and diplomacy. Rubin instructs senior military officers deploying to the Middle East and Afghanistan on regional politics and teaches classes regarding Iran, terrorism, and Arab politics on board deploying U.S. aircraft carriers. Rubin has lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, pre- and post-war Iraq, and spent time with the Taliban before 9/11. His newest book, Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes, examines U.S. diplomacy with rogue regimes and terrorist groups. Rubin received a B.S. degree in biology from Yale University, as well as a Ph.D. in history from Yale. He has worked as a lecturer at Yale University, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and at 3 universities in northern Iraq. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Rubin. Our next speaker, Ambassador Chas W. Freeman, is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, Ambassador to Saudi Arabia during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Acting Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and Charge d'Affaires at Bangkok and Beijing, and currently a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. He began his diplomatic career in India and also specialized in Chinese affairs. He was the principal American interpreter during President Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972. Ambassador Freeman is the author of several books on statecraft and diplomacy, with his most recent being America's Continuing Misadventures in Middle East. Chas Freeman studied at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and also in Taiwan, and he graduated magna cum laude from Yale University and earned a JD from Harvard Law School. Currently, Ambassador Freeman chairs Projects International, Inc., a Washington-based firm that helps its American and foreign clients create ventures across borders. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Chas Freeman. Today's discussion will last about 45 minutes, and then we will have around 30 minutes for questions from the audience. We are very fortunate to have Professor Joanne Hart here to facilitate today's conversation. Professor Hart is an adjunct professor at the Watson Institute and a professor at Lesley University. She graduated from UCLA and received a PhD in political science from NYU. Hart is a practitioner in international conflict resolution. She serves on the board for the international NGO Search for Common Ground and has worked with the U.S. military on security challenge in the Persian Gulf. She convened a U.S.-Iran working group on avoiding incidents at sea in the Persian Gulf, and she was invited on 2 occasions to meet in a small group with former President of Iran, Ahmadinejad. We are so honored to have such distinguished speakers here today at Brown, and we are very excited for an informative and productive conversation. Let's give our panelists a warm welcome.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for being here. It's wonderful to have our speakers with us. Dr. Rubin coming up from Washington and getting on Ambassador Freeman's very busy schedule. So this is a good opportunity to talk to, one of the things we love to have at the Watson Institute is real practitioners, and that's what we have here today, and it's a great chance to say, well, with your deep experience in policy, what do you make of the situation now? So I want to just throw out an opening question to both of you, and it's pretty easy to think that, well, we have a new American president and somebody without a lot of experience in not only foreign policy, but certainly of the Middle East. So if you were giving your advice, and of course this is not even really hypothetical because you both do give your advice, what is it that the new president should be aware of? What recommendations would you make about where the U.S. should go toward Iran and to whatever extent you want to say to the Middle East in general? And then whatever you don't get to, we'll continue, but please.
Okay. Well, I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past. And admittedly, I only get it right about 50% of the time, and perhaps some people after today would say, maybe that's being optimistic, that I'm only getting it wrong 50% of the time. But when it comes to Iran, specifically, there's lots of things that should be on our radar screen. American policy too often is geared to being reactive rather than being proactive, and that's certainly been the case over the last quarter century or so. It's not a partisan issue. It goes much deeper than that in terms of how we structure strategy, in that however much we have a strategy today. Now, a few issues. I personally am critical of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called Iran nuclear deal, and in questions and answers and so forth, we can go into that more deeply, should you so choose. I mean, certainly there's been no shortage of debate about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and so I'm not sure we need to rehash it right now, at least in our opening statement. But given the way which the deal was structured, if President Trump serves 2 terms, or after the first term of whomever his successor will be, many of the controls that are inherent in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action will begin to expire or be removed. Therefore, rather than simply debating what we thought about the deal, it's imperative that we start thinking about how are we going to have a policy towards the Islamic Republic of Iran the day after the various conditions start to be lifted. After all, Iran basically said that we're willing to engage in this deal, but we're not going to subordinate ourselves perpetually. Once we have a clean bill of health, we want to be treated like everyone else. And at the same time, for perhaps the first time, when a country is coming in from the cold with regard to disputes about its nuclear program, that nuclear program is being retained at basically an industrial scale. Iran, for example, will have left 5,000 P1 centrifuges. Pakistan built its nuclear arsenal with 3,000 P1 centrifuges. Contrast this to Libya in 2003, for example, where the Libyans had, their program was physically dismantled. And in 1991, when the South Africans decided to give up their nuclear program, the International Atomic Energy Agency basically said, you need to come clear in the last 20 years of your nuclear work so that we can make sure everything is accounted for. And even with a fully cooperative South African government, it took the International Atomic Energy Agency 19 years in order to give South Africa a clean bill of health. So you do have the problem about the day after with regard to Iran. One of the other things that we need to be prepared for, and this is more an internal Iranian issue, is the notion of Iran, the Iranians' own unfulfilled expectations. And what will this mean? And it's all well and good for Iranian leaders to blame the plight of their economy on sanctions. But in reality, the reason why the Iranian economy is as bad as it is has to do with the Iranian management of their economy, with the lack of commercial law and so forth. Just contrast Iran and Turkey for a second. Iran is an oil-rich, energy-rich country. Turkey isn't. They both have around 80+ million people. Which has the better economy? Turkey, at least until recently, was aspiring to not only be in the top 20, but the top 10 of world economies. Whereas when one talks to Iranians, they used to see them, I mean, again, I'll be a history nerd for a second, they used to see themselves at the beginning of the 20th century akin to the Japanese or so forth, and you actually had exchanges between Japan and Iran in 1904, 1905, 1906. Before the revolution, they saw themselves on par with the southern tier of Europe, with Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece. But now, obviously, they've slipped back, and a lot of it has to do with internal mismanagement. This brings us to another issue which the Iranians themselves need to tackle, and we should start thinking about ways to do it, and that's the issue of Khatam al-Anbiya. Khatam al-Anbiya is the economic wing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Everyone knows about the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. It was like World War I on steroids. Trench warfare, mustard gas, machine gun nests, with Scud missiles going back and forth over the front lines. Well, after that war ended, the Revolutionary Guard became the elite force then, but they didn't want to go back to the barracks. So, I mean, without moral equivalence, they decided to go into the civilian economy. It became like taking the Army Corps of Engineers, merging it with Bechtel, Halliburton, KBR, ExxonMobil, Shell, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman. About 40% by some estimates of Iran's economy is controlled by the Revolutionary Guard, heavy manufacturing and so forth. How do you change the stranglehold? If the official budget of the Revolutionary Guard is about $5 billion per year, which in the scheme of things isn't much, and the smuggling income across the Persian Gulf is another $11 or $12 billion per year, and single source contracts to Khatam al-Anbiya are upwards of $50 billion per year, that means that the Iranians could have an epiphany, take the official budget of the Revolutionary Guard to zero, and they'd still be facing less of a budget cutback proportionately than the Americans have through sequestration. The last point I want to make, and I'm purposely trying to be provocative so that we have a lot of things to discuss. I don't want to just repeat the Boston Globe or the New York Times or Washington Post, is when we think about the last several American administrations, the foreign policy crisis in which we became engaged and which ended up defining the presidency was something that wasn't on the radar screen during the campaign. So I mean, with Bill Clinton, of course, no one saw what was going to happen in Yugoslavia happening in Yugoslavia. With George H.W. Bush, no one foresaw going into Iraq with Operation Desert Storm. No one predicted the invasion of Kuwait. Likewise, with George W. Bush, no one really saw the whole issue with regard to 9/11, going into Afghanistan, going back into Iraq. It wasn't on the radar screen during the campaign. And with President Obama, no one thought that we would be facing a civil war like we were in Syria. The question I have is, what could the over-the-horizon issue be with regard to the Middle East, with regard to Iran in general? And here we focus so much on people who are alive, but let's think a second about the people who might be dying. And Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, currently in the 12th or 13th year of his 4-year term, is something like 82 years old. And unlike Yasser Arafat, he hasn't appointed a successor. What's going to happen when he dies? That's one question. In Iran, the supreme leader is already preparing the people for his inevitable death. When he was being treated, I guess, for prostate cancer, he actually allowed the cameras in to take his photo in the hospital bed as a way of setting this course. Well, what's going to happen when he actually dies? We focus so much on the horse race of the Iranian presidency, and really that's a sideshow. When it comes to choosing the new supreme leader, there's an official process, but it's only happened once before in 1989, and what we know unofficially is that there was a consensus candidate that emerged beforehand and then was presented to this rubber stamp assembly of experts. What's going to happen if the Iranians can't come to a conclusion on a single supreme leader? What if there's a council of a supreme leadership? What if there's a prolonged crisis? What's that going to mean as the Iranians try perhaps to rally people to an individual? Remember, the American hostage situation had just as much to do with internal Iranian domestic politics as it did to enmity towards the United States. So how might this play out? These are all crises that are over the horizon. And actually, one last point. I used to say I wanted to talk about demography in Iran, but everyone's eyes would glaze over. So for a second, I just want to talk about sex in Iran. When Ayatollah Khomeini had a revolution, one of the first things he did was ban contraception. And posters went up across Iran that showed a perfect Islamic family with a mother, a father, and 7 children. And you had war, you had revolution, and Khomeini used to say, we didn't have a revolution over the price of a watermelon. But by the end of the Iran-Iraq war, he decided you could. And so posters went up. I mean, he discovered that condoms were legal after all. Posters went up that showed a good Islamic family with a mother, a father, and one child. The point of this is there's an assumption in the West that you have this youth bulge in the Middle East. But Iran has a different demographic profile. The birth rate in Iran today is half of what it was in the 1980s. The growth rate is about equal, just a little bit more than that of the United States. What this basically means when you read the Revolutionary Guard newspapers is that, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has given some speeches on this in the last year, is that there's a calculation that more and more people are going to be aging, they're going to be starting their families, and they're going to have fewer people behind them in order who might risk taking to the streets. If you think back to the 2009 election unrest, most of those people were in their 20s. They were the height of the Iran-Iraq war baby boom years. But there's going to be fewer and fewer 20-year-olds replacing them. What this means is a number of things for the United States. Iran is going to want to have a qualitative military edge rather than a quantitative military edge. They're not going to be able to just send 14-year-olds across minefields to sweep for mines. They're going to have to recognize that they're going to have a different situation. At the same time, the security forces calculate, at least in the short term, that it's going to be easier to control things domestically. Whereas we tend to assume in the West that it's going to be much harder to, that the path of liberalism, of reformism, is inevitable. But with that, let me stop.
Good place to take a pause there. We'll get back to many of those issues, but now, Ambassador Freeman.
Well, I'd like to say that I've had the pleasure of dealing with Iran in three very different contexts. First, brokering cooperation between the Chinese and the Iranians against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which wasn't an easy thing to do. Second, a personal experience when I was the #2 new ambassador, having just arrived in Beijing. I was the DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission. This is sort of like the COO of an embassy. And Chinese intelligence came to me and said, we hate to tell you this, but there's an Iranian hit team, 4 people in from Pyongyang, and we think they're here to assassinate your ambassador or blow up your embassy. And I said, well, that's interesting. It was Christmas Eve. And they assured me that they had put the Iranians under heavy surveillance, which in China means something. I went to my ambassador and I told him what had come up, and he asked, what should we do? And I said, well, it's Christmas Eve. Let's give everybody at the embassy the day off. I'll hire some tour buses. We'll park them in front of the embassy gates so no one can drive a truck bomb in. And we'll enjoy Christmas, and then we'll see what happens when we come back. And so everybody left. I stayed and worked till about 5:30, and finally went home and got into my apartment. Same building with the Iranian chargé, whose ambassador had also just arrived, a cleric, part of the revolution. The chargé, someone I was not supposed to talk to, but we rode the same elevators, we were at the same things, and I'm inherently polite. He was a former consul general in San Francisco and had pretty good feelings for Americans. So I walk into my apartment and the phone rings, and it's the Iranian, now DCM, #2. And he says, Chas, I just wanted to wish you Merry Christmas and apologize for not being able to send you a Christmas card. And I said, I can't remember the man's name, I think it was something like Mehmet. I said, Mehmet, I never expected a Christmas card from you. It's very kind of you to call. I appreciate it. He said, well, there's some people on the street saying that you think there's a bunch of Iranians here who are trying to kill your ambassador, blow your embassy up or something. And I said, Mehmet, you should never listen to rumors from the street. I don't know where you get this stuff. And he said, no, he said, I just wanted to call and say that you personally have nothing to worry about, which is the Iranian sense of humor. I've always been grateful for that, and nobody got blown up. And the third time was during the Gulf War of 1990-91, when on at least 50 occasions the Iranians could have screwed us up and didn't. They behaved in a very disciplined and responsible fashion, as they did indeed after the overthrow of the Taliban in Afghanistan, after our invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. You can do business with them. I think we have to, it's very easy to tick off a lot of things that are unpleasant or objectionable about the Iranians, but I think we need to start from what U.S. interests are. And U.S. interests demand either a regional balance in the Gulf, which we had until the Clinton administration, for reasons it never explained, replaced the balance of power strategy with something called dual containment, which put the U.S. in the position of containing both Iraq and Iran rather than manipulating the balance as we'd always done, and put a large number of troops into the region, kept them in air, which led directly to 9/11. Or we can find a way to go back. We can continue with dual containment, or we can find a less fatiguing, less expensive, less provocative, less productive of blowback kind of approach, like over the horizon balancing, going back to balancing powers in the Gulf. So the first question is regional balance. Now that is very, very difficult, in part because we destroyed Iraq as a potential balancer. And there isn't any obvious coalition that is politically feasible. I mean, theoretically, you could imagine Saudi Arabia and Israel and Egypt all joining together, but that is a very theoretical possibility. So the first question is, how do we cut our losses in the Gulf? How do we reduce our profile and the consequences it has for our own society, whether economic or in terms of domestic tranquility? Then there's a question, obviously, about nuclear proliferation. But frankly, you can't deal with the issue of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East if you ignore the existence of Israeli nuclear weapons. I mean, Iran is very much aware that if it attacked Israel, it risks suicidal destruction. And by the way, all of those weapons that we sell to the Saudis and others in the Gulf, given Iranian conventional weakness, are quite adequate to balance Iran in that domain. The problem is not in that domain. The problem is political influence. And that political influence, the dominance that Iran now exercises over politics in Iraq, the influence it has in Syria with the Assad government, the fact that Hezbollah is the dominant political force in Lebanon and allied with Iran, the unease and unrest in Bahrain, where a Sunni minority monarch rules over a Shiite majority population, and of course the war in Yemen, are all connected to Saudi-Iranian rivalry or Israeli-Iranian rivalry. And we have to deal with these rivalries. We can't ignore them. And we can't say one side is entirely at fault and hope to produce a solution. So I guess my recommendation, to go back to the original question, would be I would have several recommendations. Number one, establish a policy process and staff the government. Because there is no policy process and there's no staff. Most of the cabinet secretaries are essentially home alone. And the government is winging it, as shown in the response to the attack, alleged the Syrian government attack with chemical weapons in Idlib province in Syria, which we can talk about if you will, if you would like. Get a government. And then systematically start with looking at American interests, which are regional balance, stability, no proliferation or rollback of proliferation, and dealing with Daesh or the Islamic Caliphate and Sunni extremism, which Iran is also very relevant to. And if we did those things, I suspect we would come up with a very different set of policies than the ones that we've inherited. I think in this process we would need to preserve the JCPOA, whatever defects it may have. And I note that both Israel and Saudi Arabia, who are the principal opponents of it, and who actually have both an intelligence alliance and a political alliance on Capitol Hill directed at Iran, I note that they both now prefer that the agreement remain rather than be torn out. And I think that the question of how to deal with the expiration of that agreement and what to do about it is really the relevant one. In essence, that's what I would do. But I don't think we have a strategy, so it's very hard to criticize it since it doesn't exist.
Great start. I want to ask you both to say more about Iran and the region, because you both touched on it already. It's a mistake to look only at one actor, and we can't do that with Iran. The Saudi-Iran dynamic is important. There's a war in Yemen. The Iran-Syria alliance and war in Syria. Would you widen out your perspective and talk about Iran and the region, and what do we do with our partners? You can bring the recent events with Syria and Russia if you'd like, but why don't we take a bigger angle on this?
Can I start?
Please.
I was in Damascus in March, the end of March 2011, when the unrest began in Dahria in the south. And it was pretty evident from the beginning that the desire of particularly Qatar, but also Saudi Arabia, to get rid of the Assad regime had resulted in the immediate supply of weaponry. There was immediate shooting on both sides in that region. It's a myth to say that the Syrian protests began as a peaceful demonstration of they weren't peaceful. It's not a myth to say that the Syrian government overreacted. But from the very beginning, Syria has had the characteristics of an Iranian Saudi or Iranian Gulf Arab proxy war. And that has driven much of what has happened in Syria, and it has spread. The same thing's true in Lebanon. Now, 2006, Israel maimed Lebanon in a very savage bombing campaign, which had the effect of propelling Hezbollah to the heights of Lebanese politics, where it remained. The Saudis and Hezbollah are mortal enemies. The Saudis spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to influence the Lebanese election, and it was marginally successful. But the fact is the government in Beirut includes Hezbollah. Hezbollah has intervened in Syria and has become far more formidable as an enemy of Israel than it ever was. This is not a series of events or trends that we should be trying to encourage or continue. Iran, when the United States conducted regime removal but not regime change in Iraq, leaving anarchy, that anarchy was filled by returnees from exile in Iran. And the government in Baghdad is very much beholden and influenced by Qom as well as Tehran. I think a sensible Saudi policy would be to work with Najaf and Karbala in the south, which are alternative centers of Shiite thought, but that's apparently too intelligent a policy for the Saudis to consider. We have now a broad contest, not just Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, but Bahrain and Yemen, with the potential for further trouble in Afghanistan as the Western presence inevitably recedes. The regional dimension is key. And of course, the players are all shifting position. Turkey is now allied with Russia in many respects. Allied is a bad word. There is an entente, a limited partnership for a limited purpose between Turkey and Russia. Turkey is also working with Iran on a number of issues. There is a command center, intelligence command center in Baghdad, which is staffed by Iraq, Syria, Russia, and Hezbollah. You know, this is an interesting development. And so perhaps where we ought to begin is by getting rid of some of our assumptions about who's good, who's bad, and all that, and go back and look at what is actually happening, because it's quite different from what we expected.
Okay. Let me start off by broadly giving the 1,000-mile overview, and then I want to touch base very quickly on the various countries in which Iran is active. I do think, of course, and I don't think there'd be any disagreement on the panel, that one needs to differentiate in Iran between the ordinary Iranian people, who may look at things one way, versus ideologues who may control the guns and may control the policy. Both the founding statutes of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as well as the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, define one of the reasons of Iran's existence, of the revolution's existence, to be to export revolution. And I used to think that sometimes, and all these politicians in Iran would drive around with WWKD bumper stickers on their cars. What would Khomeini do? Because they were always trying to put their policy disputes in the guise of of Khomeini, what Khomeini said, what Khomeini did, much in the way that our politicians in our political disputes will make reference back to the founding fathers and debate this. Well, in 2008, this debate over what exported revolution meant came to a head, whether it was about soft power, building Iran into a soft power mecca that everyone else would want to emulate, or whether it was much more focused on insurgency. And long story short, it came down to insurgency, exporting bombs and bullets and that sort of thing. And therefore, I do think that no matter what the Iranian government may say, we've got to worry about this independence of the Revolutionary Guard, this self-financed Revolutionary Guard. Now, when it comes to Iran as well, it's important to remember that Iran, along with China, Japan as well, is one of the few countries that has never been formally colonized and has a near contiguous history going back 2,000 plus years. When I was a grad student working in Iranian studies, my friends and all from Iranian studies, we used to go out on Friday nights and play this drinking game about who could name all the leaders of Iran going back into perpetuity. So you have like Ali Khamenei, Ruhollah Khomeini, Mohammad Reza Shah, Ahmed Shah, Muhammad Ali Shah, Muzaffar al-Din Shah, Nasruddin Shah. None of us got married till we were in our 30s. But that was probably just a coincidence. At any rate, the point of this is that the Iranians feel that they have this, they're inheritors of a great empire, but they feel they've been screwed over by history. And they've lost half their territory in the last 500 years. And the point is really that they, much like Vladimir Putin in Russia, have a sense of near abroad. Now, if you're a government and you know that ordinary people, ordinary Iranians, aren't very fond of you, and they aren't, that doesn't mean they're revolutionary. Because last time they had a revolution, they got a war that killed perhaps 1 million people. But when they know that they're not fond of you, then one of the ways in order to rally, but yet people are very nationalistic, you can rally people around the flag by propelling crises, or at least by talking up some of these crises in what you see as your near abroad. Now, when it comes to Iraq, Ambassador Freeman and I may have some difference of opinion with regard to our current assessment of the Iraqi government. We can put that aside. But what I would argue is that what the United States should not do is engage in a policy that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in which we want to castigate all Shiites as pro-Iranian puppets. And that wasn't what you're saying, so I'm not trying to build a straw man. We've got to look at the situation with nuance. When I was down in FAO about 1.5 years ago, FAO is that fishing village right at the tip where Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait come together, some of the fishermen told me that the biggest mistake the Americans made, and they're all Shiites at this point, is withdrawing without killing enough Iranians. There's no love lost between Iranians and Iraqi Shiites, and one of the mistakes Americans make too often is to try to define everyone down to a single variable. You're either Shiite or you're Sunni, but in reality, people's identity are multifaceted. Are you Arab or are you Persian? Or are you Kurdish or are you something else? Are you from this tribe or are you from that tribe? We have any numbers of definitions of what identity is, but if you allow the Iranians to say that we are your only protectors as Shiites, then even though most Iraqis don't particularly like Iranians, they're going to fall back into the Iranian camp. Take the Hashd al-Shabi, the popular mobilization units. I spend pretty much every Thanksgiving in a Hashd al-Shabi training camp down in Karbala. And when I see these guys, most of them are like, they're getting off buses. I'm eating with them in their chow hall. I mean, they're 15 years old to 60 years old. They really just want to answer Grand Ayatollah Sistani's call. They're not really all that political. And yet, in the next building over, I know Hezbollah guys are there because even though I don't like Hezbollah, I consider them a terrorist group. Like Ambassador Freeman, I try to be polite. If they say good evening to me, I'll say good evening to them and carry on. But what they're doing is observing these guys to see who has ideological affinity or particular military prowess in order to try to then get them to re-enlist in specific popular mobilization units that are much more under Iran's thumb. I would estimate that maybe 30% of the militias are truly under Iran's thumb, the rest aren't. And remember, when we say Shiite militias, you got about 5% of them are Christian and about 10% to 15% right now are Sunni. So even this term Shiite militia and castigating them all as Iranian isn't productive. The question I have is how can you make Iraq more independent? Now traditionally when you have big powers in the region and you have small countries or less powerful countries like Iraq or Kuwait or Bahrain, what they do is they have relations with everyone, but they tell the Iranians, we can't do what you're telling us to do because the Americans wouldn't approve. And they're telling the Americans, look, Iran is our biggest trading partner, we can't just cut them off. The problem is if we cut ourselves off economically and so forth, then they have no way to balance out and create that independent space for themselves. So that goes for Iraq and all the GCC states. Now, with regard to Yemen, I blame Saudi Arabia initially because they were taking in the Houthi areas, they were putting in madrasas that were broadcasting anti-Shia, anti-Houthi, anti-Zaidi sectarian propaganda. And the thing to keep in mind with regard to the Houthis is the Zaidi Shiites, I mean, theologically, they're about as close to Sunni as you can get without being Sunni. And when I'm sitting around with Ayatollahs in Najaf and Karbala, I mean, oftentimes, I don't know who else besides Ambassador Freeman has done it, but you're in a room, you're sitting around, there's the Ayatollah there, and then you usually have everyone else who's in the same room with you as you carry on your conversation. And I was being followed around by a Houthi delegation. What all the Iraqis were joking is they were so desperate to learn real Shiism that they were taking their lessons. The point of this is there were legitimate grievances. When I talk to my Yemeni friends now, their biggest fear is not, they don't like the Houthis at all, but their biggest fear is the Saudi bombardment. So this sort of thing does need to be addressed. That doesn't mean that the Iranians haven't tried to co-opt it, and even though it's not public, we heard about the suicide boat, the suicide drone that took out the Saudi frigate. There's another one that's been recovered that washed ashore in Eritrea, and it's got Iranian fingerprints all over it. So this is becoming a bigger issue right now. With regard to Syria, Tasnim, the Iranian newspaper close to the Revolutionary Guard, has acknowledged as of last May, more than 1,000 Iranians have been killed fighting in Syria. This is a tremendously expensive problem for them, so much so that at first they were taking volunteers, now they're actually taking their military recruits from their military academies and having them trained by fire inside Syria. The question is how long can they keep this up? Because Iranian civil society isn't toothless. Even if Iran, in my view, is a dictatorship, that doesn't mean their civil society is not toothless. So what I would argue, I mean, non-violently, one of the things we can do is simply broadcast more about what Iran is truly suffering inside of Syria. And you can do it from Iran's own newspapers, take a local story, make it a national story, and then they can't say it's all just American propaganda because it's from their own darn newspapers and news sites. With regard to Bahrain, similar to what Ambassador Freeman said with regard to the beginning of the Syrian uprising, I was tear gassed in Bahrain. I was with the Shiite opposition, and we were tear gassed. At the same time, they were throwing Molotov cocktails. Now, I spent 14 years in a Quaker school. I know nonviolence. And what I learned in comparative Quakerism was that, God, I had to take a class in comparative Quakerism. At any rate, what I learned is that Molotov cocktails are not nonviolent. I mean, you want to go for your inner light, not being lit aflame. The point is, Bahrain, very legitimate grievances. Very legitimate grievances. But that movement's been co-opted. And I think one of the issues in Bahrain that we need to address is the prime minister. Okay. I mean,
the prime minister has been prime minister for 45 years, and he's probably the richest person in Bahrain, and that money did not come from private sector activity.
Right. And basically, I mean, we're in agreement with that. Ultimately, he's the one who made the call on the February 14th, 2011 Pearl Monument uprising to fire into the crowds. At the same time, the Bahrainis do have a right to be paranoid. The 1981 coup attempt was entirely Iranian in nature. If you look at the magazines of the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, they're all illegal in Bahrain, but we have a whole set of them at the Library of Congress. They talk about training with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, declaring their fealty to Imam Khomeini and so forth. And Bahrainis have reason to be paranoid. That doesn't mean they don't need to reform. And with Lebanon, we also need to see nuance. Is Hezbollah really the most popular Shiite organization there? I'd argue no. When I talk to middle-class Shiite businessmen, they don't care about resistance toward Israel. They look at Hezbollah as a mafia. Now, why is it that they can't vote Hezbollah out? And a lot of this, the devil's in the details. For example, we talk about our gerrymandering here. Some of the Lebanese gerrymandering is so gerrymandered that you have islands of districts inside other districts just to keep power in a certain way. And it's illegal technically by Lebanese law and by the Taif Accords and so forth. At the same time, how many of you voted in the last election? How many of you, when you voted in the last election, voted in Providence, Rhode Island? Or how many of you voted by absentee in your home? Okay, in Lebanon, you're not allowed to vote absentee, which means you have to go to your ancestral district. Well, if you're from Shiite southern Lebanon, and your family has lived in Beirut for years, is Hezbollah going to let you physically go to southern Lebanon to cast a vote against them? The answer to that is no. This is the type of nuance, but again, if we're not staffed in government, we're not going to be able to actually approach this with nuance. But in summary, what I would basically say is you don't want to create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Please.
I think I'd like to agree with Michael with perhaps a slightly different optic. In Saudi Arabia, after the end of the Gulf War, on March 2nd, 1991, there was a Shiite uprising. It had been encouraged by George H.W. Bush and American rhetoric during the war. It was an article of faith in the United States, in Washington. Our newspapers, the New York Times and other supposedly authoritative sources of information, all declared that we couldn't help the Shiite rebellion in the South because the Saudis were opposed. That was totally untrue. As ambassador, they were all over me on a daily basis because, as they said, these people are Iraqis first, Arabs second, and Shiites third. They understood the differences. We impose categories which are frankly so inaccurate as to mislead. Now, by the way, I was at the, what was that, USACOM in Norfolk shortly after they received the order to plan the occupation of Iraq. And they did not know the difference between Shiites and Sunnis, which which was a bit of a problem. As they pointed out, we'd spent 3 years planning the occupation of Germany in World War II and 4 years planning the onset of Japan, and they had no knowledge. There was a very large body of knowledge, you may have contributed to it, in a process run on an interagency basis by the Department of State, but they were instructed by then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld that they were not to look at it. So a lot of the problems we have with are of the sort of ready, fire, aim variety, where we are not looking at external realities accurately. I think, I also agree about Yemen. When I was ambassador in Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, the tribal groups that became the Houthis, were on the Saudi payroll. They were allies in Yemeni politics of the Saudis. They're not Sunni officially. They're certainly not Salafi, meaning hardline Puritans. But they're very different from other Shiite groups. In fact, Shiism is a whole universe of different schools of thought, and to lump them all together is absurd. But the Saudis essentially did this, and I think the Houthis, who had a religious revival, did reach out to Iran for support. They got some, but when the war started, that alliance was pretty much cemented, and that's why you're seeing drone boats wash up in Eritrea with Iranian handiwork on them. This is a difficult part of the world, and it does not serve us well to deal with it in terms of stereotypes, but that's exactly what we do. Hezbollah, finally, I've been in Beirut since I left the government, and when I was in the government, I was not allowed to talk to Hezbollah. Since I left the government, I've met many times with Hezbollah, as well as with Hamas. Hamas is a democratic movement with very little military component, and it's the great enemy of the Saudis and the Egyptian dictatorship, for the simple reason that when you talk to Ismail Haniyeh or Khaled Mishal, as I have you, they will tell you that in the past, if you had a moral agenda in Arab politics, you needed to ally yourself with a thug, a strong man, a prince, a dictator, a general. But they have learned they can take power at the ballot box. And precisely because Saudi monarchy is a partnership between princes and religious figures, this proposition that you should go to the ballot box for power is very threatening. Hezbollah, by contrast, is a fascist organization. It began as a militia, came into being as a resistance against the Israeli occupation. It borrowed the concept of suicide bombing from Tamil Elam in Sri Lanka. First time any Muslim ever blew himself up was Hezbollah in Lebanon during the occupation. It is a fascist organization that is a state within a state. It provides services to its members, and it is also very nasty to people who do not share the joy of association with it. In other words, it's a sort of more brutal version of Federal Hill, where no one insults a woman at the expense of being kneecapped by some fellow who's perhaps associated with the mafia.
Could I just very briefly
Yeah,
highlight a
briefly,
debate
debate.
rather than engage in it?
Yeah.
I disagree with Ambassador Freeman on his assessment of Hamas, but one of the issues which is out there in the policy debate would be with regard to the ballot box and whether the ballot box, what makes legitimacy in an election, especially when movements in the Middle East have their own private militias which back them up. And it's an issue not just in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and in Lebanon, but for that matter, it's also an issue among US allies such as the Iraqi Kurds, where the Peshmerga remain very, very much party militias. But that's a subject for a whole nother debate. but I just want to highlight the presence of that debate out
Yeah,
there.
that's great. Well, I think we should open it up, see what kinds of questions and comments we have from the audience. So let me call on some of
Could
y'all.
people identify themselves?
Okay,
Like
will
who they
you,
are among themselves?
I'll say yes to you first, and then why don't you tell us who you are and your question.
Hi, I'm Jay. I would like to thank both of you for being here. I'm a sophomore concentrating in computational biology. So I felt like we had a really great coverage of some of the internal political struggles going on with Iran. But one external kind of thing, which has definitely been in, especially the U.S. media today, is the Islamic State. So I was wondering if you could comment on how some of the internal players within Iran are planning on dealing with potential players within the Islamic State, and if they're preparing for the inevitable collapse of that body and the power vacuum they'll follow.
When you say Islamic State, are you referring to the Islamic Republic of Iran?
The Daesh.
No,
Or Daesh.
like ISIS.
ISIS.
Oh, okay, well, yeah, we're two very
Oh,
different
yeah.
things. Yeah. So, Iran is completely against Daesh, ISIS. By the way, I think this is a ridiculous situation. The thing calls itself the Islamic Caliphate. Everybody in the region calls it Daesh, which is the Arabic abbreviation of Greater Syrian State, Dawlat al-Sham. Some people call it ISIS, some people call it ISIL. It all reminds me of the New York Times insistence that Saddam Hussein's name was Mr. Hussein, which is not true and never was. But anyway, the so-called Islamic Caliphate is in the process of being compressed territorially and probably will end up losing its territory, which doesn't mean it will go away. It will be a virtual state with footholds in many places. It currently has such footholds in various parts of the Maghreb and the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa and in Yemen. As well as in Afghanistan, by the way. So it's not going to go away as people will disperse. It is a movement. It is a network. It is not a state, although it tried to become one. And for a while, it was larger than the UK in territory. And it had more people than Israel. So it wasn't a minor player as a state. I don't think we can deal with this phenomenon without some kind of reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is not anything the Saudis want to hear. But there are ways I could imagine, for example, the creation of a version, an Islamic version of the CSC, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which would enable cooperation on the basis of those elements of Islam, which are very wide and common, that all sides hold and make rules and set a framework. And I don't think in the end the region can be stable without some such effort being undertaken. But we are a very, very long way from that. And what we have in the Islamic Caliphate is a phenomenon, one expression of a broader schism and war within the Islamic world. And it's one that should be very familiar to us with a Western heritage, because it mirrors the divide in Christendom that led to the 30 Years' War, in which Catholics and Protestants killed each other by the millions for no particularly good reason, or no reason that any of them could clearly explain. And of course, as you know, that ended in the Westphalian Order, which was basically let's just leave it alone and go forward arrangement. Iran has to be part of that. I agree that there are elements in the Iranian state, especially the Republican Guard, which echoes earlier ideological military forces in Iranian history. It's not a novel thing, that represent an obstacle to that. But there are also people in different parts of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other places who are prepared to give money to support the Islamic Caliphate, even though their governments oppose that. It's because this is a war within a religious community. Just to find the consequences of that are potentially huge, because the Middle East is home to only 1/5 of the world's Muslims. And Muslims in places like Indonesia, the largest Muslim state, and India, and Pakistan, and Malaysia, Philippines, Guyana, are all suffering from contagion from this struggle. So we have the possibility that what happens in the Middle East will trigger a global phenomenon. And that's another reason I think that instead of treating people with stereotypes, we need to look at realities, and we need to engage people, and we need to listen more than talk. So now let Michael let me listen.
Well, first of all, I agree with Ambassador Freeman, Chas, if I may, that, and I'm sure you've seen this during your stint in government as well, that when people start debating the terminology of what we should call someone, it's often a distraction, deliberately so, to avoid addressing the issues at hand. I experienced this in the Pentagon, whether we're going to call them terrorists or anti-Iraqi forces or insurgents or whatever. And the fact is, for all the man-hours spent on that debate, it doesn't affect the fight on the ground and defeating whoever, whatever the heck we want to call them. Now, with regard to Iran, we may have some differences. I tend not to see Iran as an altruistic power when it comes to defeating the Islamic State. I'm not saying you do either, but this is my fear. I mean, Iran on one hand does also worry about the Islamic State internally, because the people who suffer the most discrimination inside Iran are Sunni Muslims. And you have a large contingent of Sunni Muslims in Iranian Kurdistan and Iranian Baluchistan, and every now and then Iranian security forces will at least announce roundup of cells and so forth in these areas. That said, when it comes to Iran's proxies, for example, Bashar al-Assad inside Syria, before the United States began air operations, before President Obama began air operations in August of 2014 over Syria, the only active Air Force over Syria on a regular basis was the Syrian Air Force. And not one single time did they bomb the Islamic State capital, Raqqa. The reason is that oftentimes they're playing a very Machiavellian game. They want a binary choice. So Assad wants to ensure not the imminent destruction of the Islamic State, but the imminent destruction of anyone in between him and the Islamic State, so that there's not a choice. Now, I'm not a big fan of the Syrian opposition. When the definition of moderate becomes does not engage in cannibalism, you're pretty far gone.
Well, they're moderate about their fighting.
But, the fact of the matter is that there is very much a double game going here. The Iraqi Kurds, before the takeover of Mosul, were transferring weaponry to the Islamic State, thinking it could weaken Maliki, the prime minister in Baghdad ahead of the elections. So you have this sort of game, and sometimes, the Iranians often quip, but it's true across the Middle East, that the Iranians play chess while the Americans play checkers. Sometimes it seems that people are playing three-dimensional chess and we're playing solitaire.
Actually, we have a chess strategy which consists of the opening move.
That's actually, I'll have to steal that in the future. That said, there are some nonviolent things we haven't done. And this involves less Iran than Turkey.
I'll just say, I want to make sure we get to some other points too.
This will be very quick.
Because we could talk about Turkey the rest of the time.
No, this is a very specific issue.
Okay.
You can draw a correlation between the national contingents fighting in Syria for the Islamic State and Turkish visa policy. Thousands of Moroccans, thousands of Tunisians can get to Turkey no problem because there's visa waivers or visas on demand. You only have a couple dozen Algerians fighting in the Islamic State inside Syria because you can't get visas on demand. So why the heck don't we pressure Erdogan to say anyone under the age of 40 from these countries that provide contingents has to get a visa in advance? And the last point, very quickly, is I agree with Ambassador Freeman. What happens Syria doesn't stay in Syria. My fear is when you look at the trajectory of the Middle East, it used to see itself on par with East Asia. Then it saw itself on par with Southern Europe, and each time it fell behind. What happens if it falls behind Sub-Saharan Africa? And the Sub-Saharan economy is booming. What happens? Are you going to have, when you have this modernist movement, are people going to double down on the forces that are going to drag them further down? Or are they going to assimilate some other way? And only time will tell.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Great. No, not at all. Who has another question, please?
So actually, to follow up on that and some of the other things you said, it appears that if you're trying to achieve peace in the Middle East, right? You said Westphalian style peace among nations kind of ignores religious dimensions of conflict. Probably you said that there's some debate about whether or not you could get military style cooperation between the states. Is there any way that you can actually have Sunni and Shia states and Iran and Saudi Arabia come together beyond military alliance? And if not, is there a solution? One thing I'm thinking of at least is there a way to invest in stable states that are relatively not involved in sectarian conflict and make them beacons of progress?
Well, very short answer would be yes. Simply because when you look at the broad swath of Islamic history, the sectarianism and the polarization that we see right now hasn't been perpetual. It's ebbed and it's flowed. One of the reasons why there's such problems right now is when you look at a basic guide to Islam and you read 10 to 15% of the Muslim world is Shiite, the rest is Sunni, it ignores that from the Mediterranean, draw a circle around the Arabian Peninsula and Iran, and it's 50-50 parity, which is why there's a sense of crisis. But that said, a lot of that's driven by incitement. What I would argue in response to you, it's an interesting proposal, but I think we need to have a much better response to incitement. Ambassador?
Prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Sunni-Shia relations were often strained, but mostly peaceable. The tribes in Iraq contained both Shiite and Sunni elements. There was a great deal of intermarriage. I say that because I think we have to accept that we catalyzed the current religious strife, and it is anomalous in Islamic history. Eventually, in Christendom, we got over the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and its consequences. There is a Reformation going on within Islam now, very similar sort of reasoning to that which Martin Luther applied. Our religion, our way of life is corrupt. It needs to be reinvigorated, purified. The way to do that is to look at the early disciples and the earliest practices of our religious community, the Salaf, the people around the Prophet Muhammad, and copy their behavior. And the problem is the fundamental difference of opinion about what that behavior was. And most, for example, the late King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, a good friend of mine, very forcefully made the point that Islam, in its earliest days, was not xenophobic. It accepted Hellenistic thought and, in fact, preserved it for regurgitation into Europe, where it caused the Renaissance. It was not misogynist. Women had a prominent role in life. It was not intolerant. Jews and Christians were the finance ministers, the equivalent of prime minister in early Islamic governments. And in fact, as you know, Jewish communities thrived in both Al-Andalus, the Muslim Spain, and in the Ottoman Empire. So it was a zone of, compared to the Christian zone, really rather good on these levels. There's nothing to say that tolerance, opening to outside ideas, and by the way, devotion to science and technology, because it's not an accident that algebra is the name of an Arab, distorted in English. Al-Jabr was the inventor of it. It's not early chemistry, physics, math, astronomy, and other sciences were all pioneered in something called the Beit al-Hikmah, which was in Baghdad, started in Damascus, moved to Baghdad. So all of this is there as a resource to be invoked, to be propagated, but it's got to be done by Muslims. And it will not be done by shutting off immigration to the United States by Muslims, or giving people the third degree when they try to get in here to do business or come to study. The way to influence people is not to stand on the other side of the ocean and give them the finger. You have to mix it up with them and be prepared to accept it. You'll agree on some things and disagree on others. So part of this is bound up in what I call the nonsense of soft power. Nobody ever thought about the idea of soft power until Americans defined power as purely military. And then we had to find a way of reintegrating the concept of political, economic, social, cultural influence and control. And if we don't come up with a strategy for dealing with all of the phenomena we've been talking about, that includes diplomatic, intelligence, law enforcement, economic, cultural, information, as well as military actions, we are headed for more of the same on an intensified basis. So yes, we could see an end to the worst features of the current moment. If we continue with more of the same, we'll get more of the same.
I think we have time for one more question, and we'll only have to make it brief, but let's go for it, please.
Just a comment. What we probably need to do is wait till the 30 years are up, have the Treaty of Mecca, and then have everybody sign it at the Kabbalah, and everybody would be happy forever after. Now, another sort of a pseudo question, maybe a comment. There's a gentleman in this building by the name of Professor Kinsler, who wrote a great book called All the Shah's Men.
Right.
And we're about 60 years after one of the early democracies in the Middle East was overthrown by our CIA, if you believe his book, which I happen to. And you think of everything that's happened since then, and you wonder the machinations and the start of this. So they had a democratically elected government. We get the Shah installed, who was ruthless, probably about as ruthless as anyone could be. Then they have the revolution, you get the theocracy. Then we have the hostage crisis. And now we have Iran as one of our great enemies. Every time the enemy list comes up, it's North Korea, Hezbollah, and Iran. And I'm trying to think, in many ways, what has Iran, this is the question finally, what has Iran done to this country that is so terrible?
I think, in a sense, the Islamic Revolution was a precursor of much that's going on now in the Arab world. It was an act of self-determination. It was an act of repudiation of perceived victimization by external powers, including the Russians, including the British, and ultimately us. And I know, not to go on, that today in Moscow, Secretary of State Tillerson remarked that the United States did not see Mr. Assad as part of Syria's future or any member of his family. To which my reaction was, wasn't the legitimacy of government to be determined by the consent of the governed? Is it the case that foreigners, even Americans with such pure hearts and clean hands, should decide who rules where in the world? I mean, I think, part of part of doing better is accepting the world as it is and working to make it better, not insisting on overthrowing existing realities. In any event, the Iranian government is convinced that we are attempting to overthrow its regime, that regime. There are many in this country who would like to. It has been demonized, and to the extent that we confirm Iranian paranoia, we will get irrational or very difficult and nasty reactions out of the Iranians. Now, if we stop trying to overthrow the regime or abjure the wish to do so, that isn't going to solve very much either. You need to have a plan of positive engagement, and we don't have one. Everything we do with Iran is in a negative mode. It's deterrent, it's punishing them, it's so on. And frankly, I look at the JCPOA, the Joint Common Plan of Action, and I see a negotiation in which we could have gotten vastly better terms 12 years ago than we ended up getting. This was a case in which we were the ones refusing to talk, not the Iranians. And we have drawn the wrong lessons from it. The lesson we've drawn is that sanctions work. The lesson that should be drawn is that sanctions work only when they're given up as part of a bargaining process. And that not talking to people is sometimes a negotiating strategy, but mostly not. I think one of the things I wish we would do in our government, which the US military does religiously and very effectively, is do after-action reviews. What worked? What didn't work? Why did it work? Why didn't it work? What can we learn from what we've just done? We should do that on the civilian side. We should do that for diplomacy, for economic policy, for cultural policy, and we don't.
Last word.
Very,
Dr. Rubin.
very briefly, I'll disagree with your historical reading of Mossadegh. The Shah came into power in 1941. Mossadegh was a Democrat if you agreed with him. He's a Democrat like Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti. A Democrat if you agreed with him, and you're liable to find yourself hacked or beaten to death if you disagreed with him. Regardless, the Shah was the head of state before and after, and Mossadegh was trying to subsume that extra constitutionally. So it's a little bit more complicated, sir. I'm sorry, in this case, factually, I don't think you have, I think you're incorrect.
You're not saying that the U.S. didn't
No.
install
No,
the
no.
Shah
No, and you're also-
after
Let
it was
me-
over?
Let me finish.
All right.
The Shah was there before.
How did
The
he get
Shah, well, this is the other part of the
First
irony.
Shah. How did he get there?
The Shah
Yeah.
came to power, the Shah's father came to power
How?
in 1925.
How?
In 1941, he was, because of alleged sympathy toward Nazi Germany, he was exiled to South Africa. He died. The Shah's son came to power then. He was in power in 1941. Mossadegh, excuse me, sir. Mossadegh tried to force him out of power. Not only the United States and Great Britain, but also the clergy in Iran operated jointly with a good section of the Iranian military to reinstall him. Now, this is the irony of apologizing to the Islamic Republic, because we were apologizing to our co-conspirators in this. So it's a little bit more complicated there, but the real source of anti-Americanism inside Iran was actually the diplomatic immunity which Americans had, more broadly than just the diplomats. All the Bell helicopter people, people who were involved in drunk driving accidents couldn't be prosecuted because American businessmen and so forth had diplomatic immunity. That really was the driver of anti-Americanism from the 50s and 60s on up, and explains some of the sensitivities in Iraq towards the idea of broader immunity in a post-status of forces example. Now, one of the issues with regard to diplomacy and talking, I happen to disagree with Ambassador Freeman here. Between 1998 and the year 2005, the European Union tried positively through critical engagement and so forth, through greater trade, to incentivize Iran in a better direction. Trade between the European Union and Iran tripled, the price of oil quintupled, and about 70% of that hard currency windfall went into their covert ballistic missile and nuclear programs. So I'm not sure it works when the guys who are controlling the guns, the guys who are controlling the disbursements, are problematic. On February 9th, 2005, Rouhani gave a speech at Firdaus University in Mashhad in which he said, our strategy is a doctrine of surprise. We lull the Americans into complacency with dialogue, and then we deliver the knockout blow. We can't ignore the ideology, and simply talking doesn't change that. But with that, I mean, we've highlighted our similarities, we've highlighted our differences. There's a lot to discuss.
Well, the main thing we have to do is thank you both. Thank you for coming up from Washington. Thank you for giving us your time, this expert panel. Thank you very much.